The rain had been falling since morning, the kind that made the streets of a small Oregon town look washed, clean, and lonely at the same time. Laura Bennett stood in her kitchen, staring at a cold cup of coffee, when a sudden knock broke the quiet. It wasn't loud, but it was unexpected, sharp enough to pull her out of her thoughts. She hadn't been expecting anyone. That was the strange part. No one ever came by unannounced anymore. She hesitated before opening the door, smoothing her sweater as if it mattered. When she finally turned the handle, the sight in front of her made her pause. Ethan Miller stood there, rain clinging to his dark jacket, a small wrapped box held carefully in both hands. He looked older than the boy she remembered, yet something familiar rested in his eyes, kindness mixed with nerves. For a second, neither of them spoke. "Hi, Laura," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I hope I'm not interrupting." She blinked, surprised, then smiled. "Ethan, no. No, of course not. Come in." As he stepped inside, Laura noticed how the house suddenly felt smaller, as if it was aware of the presence of someone new. Ethan wiped his shoes and glanced around, his gaze landing on framed photos, old furniture, and the quiet proof of a life lived carefully after loss. "I was in town," he said, shrugging slightly. "My mom asked me to stop by." At the mention of Rachel, Laura's best friend of more than 20 years, her expression softened. She should have called, "Is everything okay?" "She's fine," Ethan replied quickly. "She's in Vancouver for work. This is just something she wanted you to have." He handed her the box. Laura accepted it, surprised by its weight. And by the way, her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment. It was nothing, really. But it stayed with her longer than it should have. "You didn't have to bring this yourself," she said. "You could have mailed it." Ethan smiled faintly. "I wanted to make sure you got it." They moved to the living room, the sound of rain filling the pauses between their words. Laura offered him tea. He declined politely and sat on the cade. I declined politely ingredients. If you're using like a scanner, excitingly if you're using like a scanner app, and it's like, "We're gonna die." Like, look at this, we're gonna die. Like, look at this. Like, we uncretinate. And we all know I've been exploring that. I've leave K's that we decline by clee.cline by tapped aside. I can leave like a slad / unquaid. I cake to you to kai key we you are unquiac can love to we sick can night k side edge of the couch, careful, as if he didn't want to take up too much space. Laura studied him without meaning to. The boy who once talked too fast and laughed too loud was gone. In his place was a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. She felt an odd mix of warmth and unease, though she couldn't explain why. So she said, lifting the box, "Should I open it?" "Yes," Ethan said, almost too quickly. Then he added, "Please." Inside was a silver bracelet, simple and elegant, catching the light from the window. Laura's breath caught. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was thoughtful, personal. "Oh," she whispered. "It's beautiful." She looked up at Ethan, unsure what to say next. "This is far too much." "It's not," he said gently. "You deserve nice things." The words lingered in the air. Laura smiled, though her chest felt tight. "Thank you. Please tell your mom thank you too." Ethan nodded, but didn't say anything. Instead, he shifted slightly, as if there was more he wanted to say but wasn't sure how. As Laura placed the bracelet back in the box, she noticed something else beneath the soft lining and envelope. Her name was written on it in neat, careful handwriting. She frowned slightly. "There's a letter in here." Ethan's shoulders stiffened. "Did Rachel write this?" Laura asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No." Laura looked from the envelope back to him. "Then who?" "It's part of the gift," he said, his voice low. "You can read it later." The room felt suddenly warmer. Laura nodded, though questions filled her mind. She had learned over the years not to press people before they were ready. Ethan stood, clearly preparing to leave. I should go. Roads aren't great with the rain. Of course, Laura said, walking him to the door. Thank you for coming by. He paused at the doorway, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Something serious, something unspoken. I'm glad I saw you, he said. So am I, she replied, surprised that she meant it. After he left, the house returned to silence, but it felt different now, charged, as if something had shifted. Without her permission. Laura carried the box to the dining table and sat down. She traced the edge of the envelope with her thumb, her heart beating faster than it should. A letter. From Ethan? Why? She told herself not to overthink it. Maybe. It was a simple note, a thank you, a memory from the past. Still, she didn't open it right away. Her mind wandered back years earlier, school events, birthdays, moments when Ethan had been around so often he felt like family. She remembered encouraging him when he struggled, listening when he felt misunderstood, laughing when he was young and careless. She had never imagined that any of it had stayed with him. Finally, she opened the envelope. The first line made her stop breathing. The letter wasn't long, but every word felt carefully chosen. Ethan wrote about gratitude, about growing up, about how some people leave marks on your life without ever trying to. He spoke of respect, of distance, of feelings he had tried to ignore for years because he knew they complicated everything. Laura's hands trembled as she read. He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't confessing in a dramatic way. He was simply being honest, placing his truth in her hands and trusting her not to break it. When she finished, she folded the letter slowly and stared at the table. Her thoughts raced. Confusion mixed with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She stood and walked to the window, rain blurring the world outside. Her reflection stared back at her holder, wiser, but suddenly uncertain. The gift wasn't just a bracelet. It was a door she hadn't known existed. And as Laura stood there, listening to the rain, she realized that something had begun, something quiet, complicated, and impossible to ignore. The letter did not leave Laura Bennett's hands that night. She read it once, then again, then folded it carefully as if it were something fragile and alive. Sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, Ethan's calm voice returned, steady and honest, carrying words that had shifted something deep inside her. Morning arrived with pale light and unanswered thoughts. Laura went through her routine coffee. Shower, quiet, house, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The bracelet sat on the kitchen counter untouched. The letter rested beside it, heavy with meaning. She told herself to be practical. She was older. She had lived enough to know that feelings alone could complicate lives. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she could not ignore the respect and restraint in Ethan's words. He had not crossed a line. He had trusted her with truth. Days passed. Laura kept busy. Quarry runs, long walks, catching up on work she had delayed. Still, the silence between her thoughts kept returning to him, to the way he had stood in her doorway, nervous yet certain, to the careful way he had written her name. Rachel called from Vancouver, cheerful and unaware. Laura laughed at the right moments, answered normally, and said nothing about the gift or the letter. She wasn't ready. Then, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Laura made a decision. She texted Ethan, "If you're free this week, I'd like to talk." The reply came minutes later. "Anytime, just tell me," when they agreed to meet at a small cafe near the river, a place Laura often visited alone. It felt neutral, safe, the kind of place where people spoke quietly and left space between words. When Ethan arrived, Laura noticed how composed he looked. No tension, no expectation. He greeted her politely like an adult meeting another adult, not someone carrying a secret hope. They sat across from each other, mugs warming their hands. "I read your letter," Laura said. He nodded. "Thank you for telling me. I needed time," she continued. "Not because I was upset, because I wanted to understand how I felt. Ethan listened without interrupting. Laura spoke honestly. She told him about her past, about loss, about how carefully she had rebuilt her life. She told him that his words mattered to Herb, but that timing, distance, and reality mattered too. "I won't pretend it didn't move me," she said quietly. "But I also won't rush into something I don't fully understand." Ethan's expression didn't change. There was no disappointment in his eyes, only respect. "I didn't expect anything," he said. "I just didn't want to hide anymore." They sat in silence, watching the river slide past the windows. When they stood to leave, there was no awkwardness, no regret, just clarity. "I'm glad you told me," Laura said. "So am I," Ethan replied. They parted without promises. Life slowly returned to rhythm, though something inside Laura had shifted. She found herself more open to conversation, more present in the moment. The loneliness she had grown used to felt lighter now, like a coat she could finally take off when the sun appeared. Weeks later, Laura wore the bracelet to dinner with friends, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. That connection could still find her. That honesty still mattered. One evening, she received a message from Ethan. Just a simple update about work and life. Nothing emotional, nothing heavy. She smiled before replying. Day conversations became occasional and easy, respectful, balanced, no pressure, no expectations. And Laura realized something important. The gift had never been about romance alone. It had been about being seen, and sometimes that was enough to remind someone that their heart was still alive.